with the crisis worsening, I did become more interested in the conspiracy theories that I was seeing emerge. And particularly as an Asian American woman, the anti-Asian hate crimes increasing and the anti-Asian rhetoric that we're seeing increase as well in these forums was obviously very personally important for me to pay attention to and to be aware of. But basically what we're seeing is that any kind of crisis can be seen as opportunity. And the same goes for conspiracy theorists. It goes, we can say the same thing for right-wing activists. And we're seeing kind of the logical conclusion of turning this crisis into opportunity with the emergence of these reopen Michigan protests, reopen Maryland, reopen all these states. A lot of people are trying to kind of like push the idea that these protests are grassroots movements, but a little bit more digging has revealed, and not that much digging, that a lot of these protests are actually being organized by large right-wing organizations. Like in Michigan, for instance, the Michigan Conservative Coalition was found to be the one organizing the Michigan protests, and that group is linked to the DeVos family. Using a similar model, a lot of these other protests that we're seeing spring up are also being funded by large right-wing organizations or think tanks or players in the Conservative Party in order to mobilize and to get momentum going for these protests. I'm sure as many of you have seen, there are pictures of these protests where people are waving Trump flags, they're waving Confederate flags, the Don't Tread on Me Gamson flags, as well as kick flags that are emerging, which are typical of like 4chan alt-right brand of right-wing activism. And a whole slew of other organizations are kind of attaching themselves to these protests as well. And so what conspiracy theories are really interesting to observe about them is that they tend to draw their discursive power by aligning themselves with other conspiracy theories. And research has also found that a belief in one conspiracy theory means that you'll probably be more willing to accept another. And so conspiracy theories around this have ranged from everything that it's 5G that's causing this, to Bill Gates created the virus, to the fact that the virus may have been created in a lab, which was pushed by some scientists and doctors, has led to another whole slew of conspiracy theories about this being a Chinese bioweapon. But interestingly, when we look at other parts of the world, in China, for instance, the conspiracy theory is being pushed that this was an American bioweapon. And in the Middle East, it's being pushed that it was an Israeli bioweapon that was funded by the United States. And so we're seeing different variations of the very same conspiracy theories emerging in different pockets of the world, depending on the social, political, and economic anxieties that are present in the public. What this means for the greater study of like male supremacist movements and right-wing groups is that we need to start paying attention to how these conspiracy theories are not only just evolving, but how they're being used by different groups to advance their own agendas. We've also seen these conspiracy theories being married to the larger anti-vaxxing movement. I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen content about how the virus being developed is a way for all of us to lose our bodily autonomy and to be forced to be vaccinated. And as many of you have probably already seen, there were some signs at these protests that said, "My body, my choice." And so they've also started co-opting feminist rhetoric and other left-wing movement rhetoric in order to advance their own agenda. So we have a lot of things moving here, but at the end of the day, a lot of these conspiracy theories have been around before the crisis. And conspiracy theories merely tend to reflect the fears and anxieties of the people or groups that hold them. And so in the piece that I recently wrote for Rant Media, there is some concern that the fact that a lot of us are in self-isolation will result in more radicalization of the general public. However, I argue that a lot of these conspiracy theories and a lot of these extremist groups are merely tapping into a form of radicalization that has already begun. And particularly when it comes to Asian hate crimes, anti-Asian sentiment is centuries old, and many people practice casual racism towards Asians, and it's mostly pretty much accepted in a lot of Western contexts to do so. So with that, I'll let Alex introduce our last panelist.
Thank you so much, Julia. So finally, Chelsea Ebin will be speaking, and she will bring the focus to her expertise in doing research on the US Christian right and looking at the ways in which religious freedom arguments are being used as part of the response to COVID-19 that are also the arguments used around women's and LGBT rights and reproductive freedom and such things.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for being here. There's been a lot of attention since 2014 to the growing rise of religious freedom claims. And 2014 is a sort of pivotal year because it is when the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Hobby Lobby versus Burwell. And when they did so, they sort of broke with precedent and changed their perception of how far religious rights extended into the sphere that we might have previously regarded as unique to another individual, right? So an easier way of saying that is that if we previously held that your right to swing your arms ends where the other person's nose begins, Hobby Lobby began to sort of open the door to say that, well, maybe if your right is a religious right, it actually goes past that other person's nose, right? And you can start to see the beginning of the pushing of the boundaries. With the coronavirus, I would again sort of echo the comments of my fellow presenters and say it is too soon to know where this leads. And so we can't draw any, conclusions from what we are seeing yet, but we can certainly highlight areas that we should be concerned about, aware of, wary of how the right might be trying to seize on the crisis in order to further its agenda. So when we look at the religious right, there are several areas where we're seeing them sort of perhaps begin to lay the foundation for an expanded understanding of religious freedom. One level, it is concerns church-state separation and funding. The CARES Act is potentially funneling billions of dollars directly to religious organizations in the form of payment to clergy salaries and religious organization rents and utilities. Previously, the Small Business Association rules prohibited the use of those loans for church-related salaries or facilities, and they have issued new guidance saying that they will, quote, decline to enforce these subsections of the rules. So there's a potential for a sort of expansion of government funding of religious activity and organization. Another level where we're seeing it is with state level exemptions from stay-at-home or shelter-in-place orders. Arizona, Colorado, Kentucky, Texas, and Wisconsin have provided limited exemptions for religious organizations as long as they practice social distancing. But Delaware, Florida, New Mexico, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Tennessee, Louisiana, New Hampshire, Mississippi, and Michigan have all provided unfettered exemptions for religious organization. And this I'm going to sort of come back around to at the end of my comments because it suggests, again, that your rights as a religious believer may supersede, may be sort of hierarchically superior to the rights of other people to remain safe and healthy, right? So I'll use Florida as an example because I am living in Florida. In the order that our governor, Ron DeSantis, issued, the first essential activity listed is attending religious services conducted in churches, synagogues, and houses of worship, right? It is the number one essential service above healthcare, above access to food, right? Above sort of your very baseline necessities. Staying in Florida, there is a religious organization called Revival Ministries International. And on March 22nd, they issued a statement on their website titled COVID-19 Restrictions and Freedom of Religion. And I just want to highlight some of the interesting things that are contained in this statement. And maybe if we send around an email, I'll link to it. They begin with a revisionist history of the founding, which is pretty common in Christian right circles. But then they follow it up with a pretty spurious legal argument that the shelter-in-place orders are arbitrary, oppressive, and unreasonable. They question the validity of public health science. And then they begin to equate religious beliefs and practice with baseline survival needs, right? And which is why I highlighted that DeSantis had listed religious fellowship above any other needs. And so if we think of liberal democracy as requiring non-hierarchical rights, right? We are all free, we are all equal, we should all be treated the same, right? 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, this is how we like to think of American democracy. What we instead are seeing is an attempt to impose a hierarchy of these rights, to give primacy or supremacy to religious believers, which, you know, has historical precedents in the form of Herrenvolk republicanism that the United States had leading up to the Civil War, right? The forcible exclusion of some groups of people from political participation, citizenship, equal rights. So the document sort of ends by asserting the supremacy of one group's rights over another. How am I on time, Alex? Should I close it out? Okay, so I'll just say the last other sort of areas I want to touch on very quickly. I mentioned funding. We're also seeing it in healthcare and employment discrimination. Franklin Graham Samaritan's Purse has opened a field hospital in New York City that requires volunteers and employees to attest to a statement of faith that marriage is exclusively the union of one genetic male and one genetic female, and human life is sacred from conception to its natural end. Certainly this could provide a chilling effect for LGBTQ individuals, as well as individuals who may have terminated pregnancy or are engaged in premarital sexual relations for receiving care. And we've also seen, I think this has gotten more media attention, attempts to suspend abortion in 12 states. These have been met with varying degrees of success, but certainly it is a moment that has been seized upon by Christian right activists. The implication for all of this is that if we allow religious freedom activists to take the space created by the pandemic, there is a potential for them to further enshrine the idea that their religious belief entitles them to take actions that can harm others in society, right? That the denial of medical service or housing or public accommodation, if done in the name of religious belief, is justified regardless of the impact it may have on those seeking services, healthcare, housing, et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Chelsea. So before we go into Q&A, Larry Rosenthal, the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, was actually able to join us today. And so he is going to offer a few remarks as well, and then we'll move into the question and answer. If you have questions that you would like to ask the panelists, please write your question in the chat, or write into the chat that you would like to ask your question verbally on video. Okay, great. So Larry, please go ahead. Oh, you're still muted.
I think I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Okay. You know, I've wanted to be unmuted for a long time. First of all, Alex, congratulations on mounting this. It's really impressive to be able to continue your work under the circumstances. So congratulations on doing this, and I thank the other speakers and everybody who's attending. I just want to make a couple of observations about the coronavirus disaster and the right wing. And one of them is kind of international and the other is domestic, US. Internationally, I think it's very striking and very important to pay attention to what Viktor Orban has done in Hungary. Orban has used this occasion to declare a state of emergency, and under the conditions of emergency, he is allowed to rule, quote unquote, by decree without reference or need to consult with the Hungarian parliament. There's long been a conversation about the relationship between illiberal democracy, of which Orban is certainly the greatest exemplar, the relationship between that and fascism as a state. Fascism comes about in both Italy and Germany under the fascists and under the Nazis. Each of them began to institute Nazism and fascism once in power by passing what they called enabling acts. In Germany, it was called the Enabling Act. It came after the fire in the Reichstag, which the Nazis set. And what it allowed Hitler to do was, in the name of emergency, to rule by decree. And that was the end of any semblance of the Weimar Republic democracy in Germany. In some sense, therefore, what I'm trying to alert people to, in my view, is that illiberalism, in the name of the COVID crisis, has crossed the Rubicon in Hungary. It has crossed from illiberalism to the condition which led to the totalitarian states in both Italy and Germany. On the domestic front, a lot of people have talked about the resemblance between the rising street protests against the restrictions of sheltering in place and that sort of thing. The analogy between that and the rise of the Tea Party in 2009. And I think there's a lot to that. I would caution people to take seriously, there was a great debate around the Tea Party. Was it a real grassroots uprising, or was it, quote unquote, astroturf, something that's imposed by powerful and wealthy right-wing forces? And the truth was, it was both. And the same is true of this uprising. You know, the DeVos family and others are backing this, and it's important not to lose sight of the fact that no matter how much money, it's still people motivated on their own who go into the streets. And the populist nature of this needs to be retained by people who want to understand it and understand it critically. The Tea Party loved to hand out, if people remember this, loved to hand out little constitutions and would have study groups on the Constitution, and believed themselves to have a unique understanding of the Constitution. Scholars used to call their view of constitutionalism populist originalism. I think what we're seeing now is, in effect, populist epidemiology in a parallel sense, that the populist originalism of the Tea Party was the conviction that, you know, it's not up to judges and it's not up to educated people and lawyers and so forth to figure out what the Constitution is about. Everybody can do that. And what we're seeing is a parallel in terms of epidemiology. We know better than the damn experts. And that's deeply rooted in right-wing populist culture in this country. My particular favorite of the signs on the streets that I've seen was, "Give me liberty or give me death." It was pointed out that these movements have usurped our bodies, ourselves. They've also usurped Patrick Henry, which also the Tea Party loved to do. People would dress up like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So let me stop there. I just wanted to give these observations on both the domestic and the international front. Thank you, Alex, for giving me this opportunity.
I think the way that we're seeing all these connections, it's really difficult to like say that there is kind of like a very like obvious through line, right? I think that's what makes conspiracy theories very hard to research in some regard, because there's all these different communities that kind of want a piece of the pie, for instance, right? They want to be able to like push their ideas and their agenda. And so sometimes they'll marry their conspiracy theory to another, and then to another, and then to another, and kind of create this like, Rat King conspiracy theory sort of beast that it's really hard to tell where it begins and ends. So it's a lot more rhizomatic than than we are kind of led to believe, right? And so I think that's where they become A, difficult to study, and B, more powerful, because we don't know where these conspiracy theories came from. They kind of almost feel like they come out of nowhere. The best places I think that I've looked in order to see how people are making connections tend to be conspiracy theory forums. So there's a very big conspiracy theory forum called Above Top Secret, for instance, or even just the conspiracy subreddit on Reddit, where they'll find a piece of information and use that, for instance, as proof that 5G is causing this virus, or they'll find examples of like Bill Gates talking about the issue of overpopulation and use that as justification for why Bill Gates may have created this virus, right? So for them, like these aren't just kind of like coincidental events, like these are causation. And so making these linkages in terms of like their like episodic narratives almost, it requires a lot of, looking at a variety of threads and stuff on these forums, but also trying to link them to kind of more historical conspiracy theories as well. So what we're seeing, for instance, with like the anti-vaxxing movement, and also too, like Bill Gates has been the subject of conspiracy theories forever. But we're also seeing, for example, conspiracy theories being linked to Jeff Bezos now, the wealthy elite. And so the anti-vaxxers are kind of using, the idea that Bill Gates created this virus in order to push his vaccination programs, which he does actually pay and sponsor vaccination programs in developing countries, in order to vaccinate everyone in the world and to advance his eugenicist agenda. That's the belief. And so you can kind of see different elements there. So I think this is going to take a lot more unpacking. And because things are evolving so quickly, I think it's very difficult to make a good assessment right now, because it literally feels like every hour there's a new piece to this conspiracy theory that's emerging. So I think we're not going to see the true kind of like bigger picture until after the crisis is over.
So it's a little bit tricky to explain Hobby Lobby's importance without going back to 1990. And I'll try and do this as quickly as I can. The Supreme Court for several decades had tended towards maintaining a high wall of church-state separation by granting religious free exercise exemptions to broadly applicable secular law for minority religious groups. And the logic was that minority religious groups couldn't influence the outcome of democratic politics in the way that majoritarian religious groups could, basically Christianity in the United States, right? So in order to keep the government from being too oppressive, we would give them free exercise exemptions. 1990, the court seemingly backs away from that a little bit in a decision called Smith versus Employment decision. How important the decision actually was is sort of no longer relevant, because Congress stepped in and passed the Restoration of Religious Freedom Act. Act, right? Congress interpreted the Supreme Court as having abandoned its previous standard of giving free exercise exemptions, passed something called the Religious Restoration of Freedom Act, referred to as RFRA. RFRA was intended, both in the actual statutory language and in the congressional debate, to apply to religious minority groups. And that's basically how it gets implemented from 1993 until the 2010s. It is in 1997, the court rules it doesn't apply to the states, and so you start to see a bunch of states pass state level or mini RFRAs. Things are sort of moving along. In 2014, there was a challenge to the Affordable Care Act's birth control mandate on the grounds of the Religious Restoration of Freedom Act, where religious organizations claimed that even with the sort of loophole created for them to not have to independently provide access to contraception, their religious beliefs were still being harmed. When the court ruled in favor of Hobby Lobby, what they determined was that RFRA applied even to majoritarian religious groups, right? So they sort of blew up the logic that it was there to protect minority groups and instead said, oh, no, this also applies to Hobby Lobby, which is an closely held private corporation owned by evangelical Christians. So the decision provides a sort of legal precedent for pursuing this strategy that's come to be known as conflicting rights, where you can try and subvert equality claims on the basis of the supremacy of the free exercise of religion clause, even if you also are a group that has considerable impact in democratic elections and is represented robustly by your elected officials.